Maramai, good morning. This is Judith Lay welcoming you to Manx Radio and to the podcast of this week's edition of At Your Service. Manx Radio! On the programme today, we discover that the London Borough of Southwark and the City of Peel have more in common than we might imagine. We learn a valuable lesson from two cats, and following on from World Alzheimer's Month, we have a gentle, prayerful blessing, especially for anyone living with any form of dementia. And as COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, enters its final week, just a little reminder that the United Nations' own website will continue to be a good way to find out exactly what's being achieved. The website address is very simple, www.un.org. But will the agreements reached be enough to halt the damage to our environment? Speaking recently about COP26, our own Bishop Peter said, "We live in a relationship with our friends in every other nation, including the poorest countries, which are those most harshly affected by the effects of a changing climate. Our duty to respond faithfully, prayerfully and humbly to this challenge is as acute as it could possibly be." We might also reflect on a few words from a joint appeal that was prepared and signed by representatives of the world's faith communities and presented to President of COP26, Alok Sharma MP, by Pope Francis. In a final section entitled Hope, it says, "We have inherited a garden. We must not leave a desert to our children." Mustn't we feel some sense of failure when we listen to singer Tom Paxton with this song written and recorded in 1971, exactly 50 years ago?
This is a song for the planet Earth, which needs all the songs it can get. Whose garden was this? It must have been lovely. Did it have flowers? I've seen pictures of flowers, and I'd love to have smelled one. Whose river was this? You say it ran freely. Blue was its color. I've seen blue in some pictures, and you tell me you've been there. Tell me again, I need to know. The forests had trees, the meadows were green, the oceans were blue, and birds really flew. Can you swear that was true?
Singer-songwriter Tom Paxton singing for the planet exactly 50 years ago in 1971. Let's pray that in another 50 years' time, the song is not the same.
Nights there were breezes, I've heard records of breezes, and you tell me you felt one. Tell me again, I need to know.
And now, what could possibly link the London Borough of Southwark on the south bank of the River Thames with the City of Peel on the island's west coast? Well, the first link is my special guest today, the Very Reverend Andrew Nunn, who is the Dean of Southwark Cathedral, and he's on the island for a few days to work alongside the Very Reverend Nigel Godfrey, Dean of Cathedral Isle of Man in Peel. But the connection doesn't end there, as we're about to find out. But first, let's have our hymn for the day. It's the choice of Dean Andrew, and we'll meet him after Huddersfield Choral Society sing "How Shall I Sing That Majesty Which Angels Do Admire? Let dust in dust and silence lie. Sing, sing, ye heavenly choir." How Shall I Sing That Majesty? The choice of first-time visitor to the island, the Very Reverend Andrew Nunn, the Dean of Southwark Cathedral on London's South Bank. In a few moments we'll find out the purpose of Dean Andrew's visit, but first let's find out a little of Andrew's own background.
Well, I was born in Leicester. I lived there until I was 21 and studying and what have you, but I always felt as I was called to ministry, to priesthood. So after being selected by the Church of England to go forward for training, I went up to Yorkshire and I was trained in Yorkshire, went to the university there to read theology in Leeds, and then stayed in Leeds for 11 years. So if people think I've got a bit of a Yorkshire accent, I picked up a bit of Yorkshire ways before going down to London to continue ministry.
And what did you do when you went to London, Andrew?
Well, first of all, I went to be Bishop's chaplain to the Bishop of Southwark, which was an absolutely fascinating job to sort of see what bishops actually get up to. We think we know what bishops do, and then all of a sudden you're seeing it and you're enabling that. And my bishop was in the House of Lords, so trying to prepare things to help the bishop in his speeches. I just love doing all of that. Here on this island, as I've been discovering some of the uniqueness of this place, the bishop here has a very particular role, doesn't he, within the legislature? And so you have to sort of ask the question, well, why is the church in that kind of place? Is it appropriate for the church to be in the place where law is being created? In this country, in our countries, we've said, yes, that it is important. We want that kind of theological and moral and ethical voice to be heard when we're making law.
So from working with the bishop, was the next step then to becoming the Dean of Southwark Cathedral?
I became the precentor, first of all, and the sub-dean at Southwark. So the precentor is the person who looks after all the services, works with the musicians, with the vergers, who are the kind of almost caretakers, but more than caretaker of the church. And that was a lovely job. And then, unfortunately, my dean died in office. It was sudden, and I helped the congregation through all of that. And then I applied for the job to be dean and was appointed dean back in 2012. And I'm still there. So from 99 to now, far too long in some ways, but in an ever-changing environment, as is South London, it feels good to have something that's consistent, that knows some of the history and is able to reflect that.
I think it's tremendously important, especially in these uncertain times that we're in. It's been said to me that the Dean of a cathedral is almost like the hub of a wheel, that you're in the centre and from you flows all the different aspects of the life of the cathedral. You've touched on some of those things, the music, the worship, the day-to-day administration. Do you think that's a fair description, Andrew?
I do, but I think it depends how many spokes you've got in the wheel. And that's where cathedrals vary so much. So if I was Dean of St Paul's, I would expect there to be lots of spokes in the wheel to help that kind of, what's almost like an ocean liner of a cathedral to work. If I was here in Peel, I would probably have fewer spokes, and so there would be much more on a practical day-to-day basis for the Dean to do rather than simply having a strategic view of the whole thing. So I think cathedrals vary massively, but I think it's a great analogy.
The London Borough of Southwark is south of the Thames and is home to Tate Modern, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, the popular Borough Market and London's tallest building, the Shard, with its iconic jagged tip soaring above the capital's skyline. It's also home to Southwark Cathedral, but like Cathedral Isle of Man in Peel, the building was not originally intended for its present purpose, as Dean Andrew now explains.
It's a really interesting story because, in fact, the Diocese of Southwark is a modern invention. It only came into being in 1905. Everyone thinks, well, London Diocese must be London. London Diocese has only ever been north of the River Thames. So that's where, in 604, that diocese was established. Winchester Diocese came up to the south bank of the Thames until there was the explosion of the suburbs, the railways, you can imagine, and South London grew up, and it was decided that there needed to be a diocese. And they looked around for a suitable church. Well, we had been established in 606, so just after St Paul's, as a little convent by the river. And that developed in the post-Norman conquest into an Augustinian priory. At the Reformation, it became a parish church for the area. And when they were looking for somewhere suitable to be a cathedral, they thought, well, this is a nice church, big enough, grand enough, in a good position. Well, let's have that one. But there was a bit of a competition around. So there's a church in Tooting, and the vicar there always says to me, actually, we're the real cathedral, because we were intended to be the cathedral. I'd say, well, anyway, we're it. And we're glad to be the cathedral.
And there's another link. Like Southwark Cathedral, our cathedral in Peel started its life as a parish church and became the island's cathedral some 40 years ago.
And you have to grow into that, I think, because we're still a parish church, as the cathedral in Peel is a parish church. And so some people look to you as being parish church, and you are. Other people need to look to you as being cathedral, which you are. And the dean and the chapter are almost two-headed, because sometimes you're thinking, am I being cathedral? Am I being parish church? How do we do all of that? So I think it takes a lot of growing into those clothes, if I might describe it like that.
You're absolutely right, because the needs of a parish church are very, very much different to the needs of the cathedral. The congregation is nurtured and supported and encouraged to grow in a very, very different way.
Absolutely. And so I personally think, and I've said this in General Synod back in England, that it would be good if every cathedral was a parish church and not just a few, because it would help us to do the very things that you've been talking about, Judith, about that care and nurturing and teaching.
Whereas a cathedral that's just a cathedral, as another dean explained to me, he said the vast majority of people who come into our cathedral will only come once, and I just want them to have the best worship experience or the best visitor experience for that one time, because they'll never come back. They're in a group or a holiday.
Yes, and you can become a place that's just for the extra special, as you describe, rather than the day-to-day ordinary, which is what parish churches do. Day-to-day ordinary worship and care of the people who live in the area. That's the calling.
Andrew, you're here on the island for a very particular purpose. You're going to spend a couple of days at the cathedral in Peel with the dean, the chapter, and everybody who's involved in the life of the cathedral, conducting something called a peer review. Andrew, what is it?
Well, it's a fairly recent development in cathedrals. So we kind of knew that we needed to be able to look at the way in which we run our cathedrals, control the finances of the cathedral, the governance and all of those particular aspects, in order that we can be the best cathedrals that we can be in our very different situations. So this scheme was set up, this process of peer review. And people imagine it's a kind of Ofsted for cathedrals. It isn't Ofsted at all. So it's meant to be extremely helpful. It's meant to be very supportive. And it's your peers coming in. So there are 3 of us in the team, have arrived here on the Isle of Man. And we're all from a cathedral background. I'm obviously still serving as a dean, and my colleagues have both been administrators in cathedrals. So we've got, between us, a lot of experience. The dean and the chapter and the staff here have provided us with a huge amount of paperwork that they've supplied us with. I think it's helped them to think about what actually they do. And we will sit down and listen to them and talk to them, and where there are things to celebrate, we will celebrate with them. And where there are challenges to be met, we will hopefully help them to think about how they might meet the challenges. I don't want anyone to think I've got all the answers, because I don't. And this is such a unique place that it calls for one-off answers anyway. What works in Southwark won't necessarily work on the Isle of Man. And I think one of the challenges, it seems to me, from having read all of the stuff we've been sent, is that the church here is in a very different situation from the church over in England, where we've got the support of the church commissioners with all of its financial resources and everything. And that doesn't apply. So many pieces of legislation that go through the General Synod of the Church of England do not apply to the Channel Islands and do not apply to the Isle of Man. So some of the safety nets that we've had during COVID for the cathedrals over in England haven't been there for your cathedral. So how do we kind of level up a bit of that, I think, is a bigger question than we're able to deal with in a couple of days. But I think a very pertinent question for you.
It sounds that this is going to be nothing but good for the cathedral. It's good for other people to be interested in what you're doing.
I hope so. I hope that when we sit down with the various members of staff and the volunteers there, they will be pleased that somebody is actually interested to hear the story of how they are being the cathedral in this particular place and in this particular time.
I'm sure that they will. I cannot possibly end this conversation without asking you about Dawkins' Magnificat, the cat who came to live in Southwark Cathedral and just became a huge presence.
She was a very proud lady. Dawkins was a feral cat. We don't know her history, obviously, but she was living in the Borough Market, which surrounds Southwark Cathedral. And she arrived in the churchyard, and our vergers, when they opened up, saw this very pretty little cat and would put a bowl of water outside and everything. And gradually over time, she became more trusting of us and came through the door. And she came through the door and we fed her. And so she stayed and she made her home with us. And she was with us until 2 years ago. She was getting quite elderly and it wasn't as comfortable a place for her in a harsh environment of a cathedral. So she went to live with the head verger for her final year and then died October last year, and that was a huge sadness to us because so many people came to the cathedral to see Dawkins. And I think it was something about the way in which she dared to come across the threshold of this strange place and found a welcome and some warmth and food and also a bit of privacy, if I may say. You know, she lived her own life and she found her own space. And I think there's something really important about that in terms of cathedrals, which should have open doors wide enough to allow anybody to come in who simply wants to come in and find God and be found by God on their own terms and know that they're welcome and safe and they're going to be in some way fed. So she became a kind of model for that sort of ministry, of sometimes simply having your doors open and seeing who arrives. If I go to our local mosque or to our local temple, I find that quite a challenging experience in that I don't know what to do. You know, when do I stand? When do I sit? How do I behave? Do I take my shoes off? This, that, and the other. I think for a lot of people nowadays, walking into a church or into a cathedral is an alien experience. They don't know what to do. And I think if we're able to show that people are simply welcome for who they are, like we're able to say to Dawkins in Cat Talk, you're very welcome, and to make them feel at home, then that is doing the work of God for this generation. You know, the walls are very thick and very high of our churches, of our cathedrals. You need to be out there in the community as well, doing the stuff out there, putting the bowl of water out there, metaphorically or actually, in order to say to people, this is a place for you. We've got a new cat, though, now, a Hodge. And Hodge arrived in a strange, mysterious way on the very day that Dawkins died. And it wasn't arranged like that. He's a rescue cat. He'd been very badly treated by his former owners in South London, and we got him from a sanctuary. And he's a little boy. He eats far too much, or we feed him far too much. He's absolutely lovely. Dawkins never wanted a cuddle. Hodge always wants a cuddle and a stroke. And so he's telling us a different kind of story. And he's got lots and lots of followers. And people absolutely love him because they can come in and he'll even sit on their knee for a time and just receive their love. And people who come along, you know, can be a bit Dawkins-like, can be a bit Hodge-like, really.
Margaret Ritzer's Magnificat seemed an appropriate way to end my conversation with the Very Reverend Andrew Nunn, Dean of Southwark Cathedral, on the island this week to spend some time with the Dean and staff of the island's cathedral in Peel. And my thanks to Andrew for joining us this morning. September each year is World Alzheimer's Month, challenging the fear that surrounds dementia that can put people off seeking a diagnosis or asking for support, and this can leave families feeling overwhelmed and alone. World Alzheimer's Month reminds us that there is support for families affected by Alzheimer's and all other forms of dementia, so they can take back control and face the future with more confidence. This morning we reach out to anyone living with dementia with this beautiful blessing written by the Irish poet and priest John O'Donoghue for his own mother, Josie, who had the illness. It's read for us by Phil Crane.
Come be with me, all you carry heavy burdens. I will give you rest. I will give you rest.
Beanacht, a Blessing by John O'Donoghue. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the grey window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colours, indigo, red, green and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays in the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life.
Come be with me, all you carry heavy burdens. I will give you rest. I will give you rest.
Thank you, Phil Crane, reading the words of poet and priest John O'Donoghue. And now it's time to take a look at our notice board. Today there's a fair trade sale in St Columba's Catholic Church Hall in Port Erin, open from noon to 4:30, with soup and roll lunches and afternoon tea available. Fair trade food, crafts, Christmas gifts, decorations and cards will be on sale. Proceeds from the sale of refreshments will go to the Loreto Sisters working with deprived children and trafficked women in Albania. Today, the regular afternoon service in Ballakilferrick moves to its winter time of 2:30, and the service this afternoon at that time will be led by the Reverend Brian Yardy. Also this afternoon at 3:00, Gareth Moore will give an organ recital in Trinity Methodist Church here in Douglas. Gareth will be playing a varied selection of music from his wide repertoire to showcase the full capabilities of this exceptionally fine musical instrument. With free admission and refreshments afterwards, this is an organ recital not to be missed. There's free parking around the church, and Trinity is situated near the Rosemount Hotel by the traffic lights on the corner of Bucks Road and Windsor Road. This evening in Dalby Church, there'll be a quiet, reflective, candlelit service of remembrance and memorial, starting at 6:30, in memory of those who have departed this life and those bereaved or mourning a loss. Everyone will be made very welcome. As I mentioned last week, there's no Mariners service tonight, but the next service on the Mariners calendar at Trinity Church here in Douglas on the 21st of November is planned to go ahead as normal. I'll remind you about that nearer the date. Looking now to the week ahead, and on Friday the 12th, there's supper and entertainment in Orrisdale Chapel. Sausage and chips and the best of Manx talent with Gordon Clegg in the chair. It's on Friday night at 7:30, and as you might imagine, supper, which is £7.50 per person, needs to be booked in advance. And you can do that by phoning or texting Pauline on 300 630 300 630. And on Saturday the 14th, it's the next meeting of the Island Spirituality Network at its usual venue, St John's Mill. It's from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m, and the speaker this month is Reverend Sean Turner, Methodist minister in the south of the island, and his theme is Shabbat Shalom, Sabbath Peace. And that's all that we have time for now, but there will be more news from the notice board during sundown tonight from 9 o'clock, when I'll be back with a mix of easy listening music to round off your weekend. Email me, please, with news for the notice board and requests for your favourite hymns. My address is judithlay@manxradio.com. I do hope you can come back and join me again later, but for now, this is Judith saying thank you for listening, and I wish you and those you love a blessed and peaceful week, and a very good morning.
Station